For over 2,500 years, one simple principle governed every major economy on Earth: money was gold, and gold was money. This wasn't just an abstract concept. It was the foundation of international trade, the backbone of government finance, and the ultimate guarantee of economic stability that enabled the greatest period of global prosperity in human history. The gold standard created the first truly global economy, where a dollar in New York had the same fundamental value as a pound in London or a franc in Paris, because every currency was anchored to the same immutable foundation, a specific amount of gold. This system financed the Industrial Revolution, built the railroads that connected continents, and created the international trade networks that lifted billions out of poverty. But in 1971, one phone call from President Richard Nixon to his economic advisors shattered this ancient system forever. In a weekend meeting at Camp David, Nixon announced that the United States would no longer convert dollars to gold, ending the gold standard and launching humanity into an unprecedented experiment with purely paper money backed by nothing more than government promises. What most people don't understand is how this single decision fundamentally altered the relationship between money, power, and economic reality in ways that affect every transaction, every investment, and every government policy decision to this day. The abandonment of gold didn't just change how we think about money, it transformed the entire structure of global power and created the economic instability that characterizes our modern world. The secret history of the gold standard reveals how this ancient monetary system both enabled the greatest economic expansion in human history and contained the seeds of its own destruction. More importantly, understanding why the gold standard died explains virtually every major economic crisis, financial bubble, and monetary policy decision of the past 50 years. This is the story of how humanity's oldest monetary system created the modern world economy, why it was abandoned despite centuries of success, and how that abandonment continues to shape every aspect of our financial lives today. British Empire. The transformation of Britain from a peripheral European island into the world's dominant economic and political power between 1700 and 1900 was inextricably linked to its adoption and mastery of the gold standard, which provided the monetary foundation for British commercial expansion, industrial development, and global empire building that reshaped the world economy. Britain's commitment to gold-based currency began with the Great Recoinage of 1696 to 1698, when the government recalled all existing silver coins and replaced them with new coins of consistent weight and purity. This monetary reform, overseen by Isaac Newton in his role as Master of the Royal Mint, established the precise standards and institutional procedures that would make British currency the most trusted and widely accepted money in international commerce. Newton's calculations established the gold-to-silver ratio that effectively put Britain on a de facto gold standard, making gold sovereigns the preferred currency for large transactions, while silver coins handled everyday commerce. This dual system provided monetary flexibility while maintaining the stability and international acceptability that gold backing provided. The South Sea Bubble of 1720 demonstrated both the importance of monetary stability and the dangers of financial speculation, reinforcing British commitment to sound money principles that would govern monetary policy for the next 2 centuries. The crisis convinced British policymakers that monetary stability was essential for long-term economic development and international credibility. Britain's formal adoption of the gold standard in 1821 reflected both the success of gold-based monetary policy and the need to restore financial credibility after the monetary disruptions of the Napoleonic Wars. The return to gold convertibility signaled Britain's commitment to fiscal discipline and monetary stability that would attract international investment and support commercial expansion. The Bank of England's role in managing the gold standard established the institutional framework that would become the model for central banking throughout the world. The bank's responsibility for maintaining gold convertibility required sophisticated understanding of international capital flows, domestic money supply management, and the relationship between monetary policy and economic activity. Britain's mastery of gold standard operations provided crucial advantages for international trade and finance that enabled British merchants and manufacturers to dominate global commerce. British currency was universally accepted because of its guaranteed gold convertibility, while British banks could provide international financing services that competitors couldn't match. The development of London as the world's financial capital reflected the competitive advantages that gold standard credibility provided. International investors preferred British investments because of the currency's stability, while foreign governments and businesses sought loans from British banks that could provide financing in universally acceptable currency. British industrial development was facilitated by the monetary stability that the gold standard provided. Long-term investment in manufacturing equipment, transportation infrastructure, and technological development was practical because investors could predict purchasing power and plan for future returns without currency risk. The railroad boom of the 1840s demonstrated how gold standard stability could support massive infrastructure investments that transformed economic geography. British investors financed railroad construction throughout the world because gold-backed returns provided predictable value regardless of local currency fluctuations or political changes. Colonial monetary systems extended British gold standard principles throughout the empire, creating integrated economic relationships that supported both imperial control and economic development. Colonial currencies were tied to British gold, while colonial banks followed Bank of England policies that maintained monetary coordination across vast geographic distances. The Victorian economic expansion between 1850 and 1880 represented the gold standard's golden age, when British monetary leadership enabled unprecedented international trade growth, capital investment, and economic development that lifted living standards throughout the world economy. British free trade policies complemented gold standard operations by creating international economic relationships based on comparative advantage rather than political favoritism. The combination of stable currency and open markets enabled efficient resource allocation that maximized global economic welfare while reinforcing British economic dominance. The City of London's development into the world's premier financial centre reflected the institutional advantages that gold standard operations provided. British banks, insurance companies and investment houses could offer services that competitors couldn't match because of the stability and universal acceptability of gold-backed British currency. International arbitrage operations based on gold standard relationships generated enormous profits for British financial institutions while providing the economic intelligence and market mechanisms that enabled efficient international resource allocation. British traders could exploit price differences between markets while providing the financial services that made international commerce practical. Maritime trade financing demonstrated how gold standard principles could support complex international transactions involving multiple parties across different countries and legal systems. British merchant banking houses developed sophisticated financing techniques that enabled global trade while managing the risks inherent in long-distance commerce. The development of international investment markets reflected British mastery of gold standard operations that enabled capital exports on an unprecedented scale. British investors financed economic development throughout the world while earning returns that supported domestic prosperity and further capital accumulation. Government debt markets demonstrated how gold standard credibility could provide governments with access to international capital markets at favorable interest rates. Foreign governments preferred borrowing in London because gold-backed loans provided predictable repayment obligations regardless of local currency fluctuations. Insurance and shipping services complemented British monetary dominance by providing the risk management and transportation capabilities that international commerce required. Lloyd's of London became the world's premier insurance market because British financial stability made insurance contracts reliable regardless of where claims occurred. Imperial finance relationships demonstrated how gold standard principles could support political control while encouraging economic development. Colonial governments could access London capital markets because their currencies were tied to gold, while British investors could finance colonial development with confidence in future returns. The technological innovations that characterized British industrial leadership were supported by the long-term investment planning that gold standard stability made possible. Inventors and entrepreneurs could develop new technologies, knowing that successful innovations would generate predictable returns in stable currency. By 1870, British mastery of gold standard operations had created a global economic system centered on London that provided the monetary foundation for the first truly integrated world economy. This system enabled unprecedented economic growth and development, while establishing institutional precedents that would influence monetary policy for the next century. However, the success of the British gold standard also created vulnerabilities that would become apparent as other nations adopted similar monetary systems while challenging British economic dominance through industrial development and competitive monetary policies of their own. Ancient foundation. The relationship between gold and money emerged from the fundamental properties that made gold uniquely suitable for serving as a medium of exchange and store of value across different cultures and time periods. Unlike other materials that societies had experimented with, such as money, shells, cattle, grain, or copper, gold possessed chemical and physical characteristics that solved the basic problems that any monetary system must address. The metal scarcity provided the foundation for its value stability. Gold was rare enough to prevent massive inflation from new discoveries, but not so rare as to make monetary systems impossible. The total amount of gold ever mined throughout human history would fill only about 3 Olympic swimming pools, creating natural constraints on money supply growth. that prevented the devastating inflations that plagued societies using more abundant materials. Divisibility made gold practical for everyday commerce. Unlike cattle or real estate, gold could be divided into precise amounts for transactions of any size, from purchasing a loaf of bread to financing international trade expeditions. This divisibility, combined with gold's high value-to-weight ratio, made it practical for both small local transactions and large international payments. The earliest recorded use of gold as money appeared in ancient Lydia around 650 BCE, where merchants began using standardized gold coins that solved crucial problems in international trade. Before standardized coinage, commercial transactions required complex negotiations about the purity and weight of precious metals, while the lack of uniform standards created opportunities for fraud and made long-distance trade extremely difficult. Lydian gold coins established principles that would govern monetary systems for the next 2,500 years. Each coin contained a specific amount of gold of guaranteed purity, backed by the political authority of the state that issued it. This combination of material value and political guarantee created money that was both universally acceptable and inherently valuable, solving the fundamental problem of creating trust between strangers in commercial transactions. The spread of gold-based monetary systems throughout the ancient world reflected both the practical advantages that gold provided and the network effects that made gold-based money increasingly valuable as more societies adopted it. As trade relationships expanded, merchants preferred dealing in gold because it was accepted everywhere, creating incentives for additional societies to adopt gold-based monetary systems. Ancient Athens demonstrated how gold-based monetary systems could support sophisticated economic development. The Athenian drachma, backed by silver from the Laurian mines, became the dominant currency for Mediterranean trade because of its consistent weight and purity standards. This monetary stability enabled Athens to finance massive public works projects, maintain a powerful navy, and support a complex economy that included international banking and insurance services. The Roman Empire's monetary system represented the most sophisticated ancient application of precious metal currency, with gold aureus coins serving as the foundation for international trade, while silver denarii handled domestic commerce. The Roman system demonstrated how gold-backed currencies could maintain value and purchasing power across vast geographic areas and extended time periods. Roman monetary policy illustrated both the possibilities and constraints inherent in gold-based systems. When the empire discovered new gold mines or conquered territories with precious metal reserves, the increased money supply stimulated economic activity and funded military expansion. However, when gold supplies were depleted or interrupted by military defeats, the resulting monetary contraction forced government spending reductions and economic adjustments. The debasement of Roman coinage during the imperial decline provided an early example of how governments attempted to escape the constraints imposed by precious metal currencies. By reducing the gold and silver content of coins while maintaining their face values, Roman emperors effectively printed money to finance government operations. This debasement created the inflation that contributed to the empire's economic and political collapse. Medieval European monetary systems inherited both the advantages and problems of Roman precious metal currencies. The Byzantine solidus maintained consistent gold content for over 700 years, making it the preferred currency for international trade throughout the medieval period. This monetary stability enabled Byzantine merchants to dominate Mediterranean commerce while providing the empire with resources necessary for military defense and territorial control. Islamic monetary systems similarly demonstrated the advantages of gold-based currencies for supporting extensive trade networks. The gold dinar and silver dirham provided stable purchasing power that enabled Islamic merchants to establish trade relationships extending from Spain to India, creating the economic foundations for Islamic civilization's golden age. The challenges that medieval societies faced in maintaining adequate precious metal supplies illustrated the constraints that gold-based monetary systems imposed on economic growth and government finance. Economic expansion required corresponding increases in gold supplies, while government spending was ultimately limited by the amounts of precious metals that taxes and trade could generate. Despite these constraints, gold-based monetary systems provided the foundation for economic development that would have been impossible with less stable monetary arrangements. The predictable purchasing power and universal acceptability of gold-backed currencies enabled long-term investment planning, international trade development, and capital accumulation that supported technological innovation and economic growth. The success of ancient and medieval gold-based monetary systems established principles and institutional arrangements that would shape economic development for centuries. The requirement that money maintain intrinsic value, the automatic constraints on money supply growth, and the international standards that enabled trade across political boundaries all became foundation elements of the classical gold standard that would dominate the modern world economy. By 1500, the accumulated experience of over 2,000 years had demonstrated that gold-based monetary systems provided unique advantages for economic stability and commercial development, while also imposing constraints on government policy and economic management that would become increasingly problematic as economic systems became more complex and governments assumed greater responsibilities for economic welfare. American adoption. The United States' complex and often contradictory relationship with the gold standard between 1792 and 1900 reflected the tensions between democratic politics and sound money principles, as American monetary policy oscillated between gold-based stability and political pressures for monetary expansion that would accommodate debtor interests and regional economic differences. Alexander Hamilton's establishment of the American monetary system in 1792 demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how gold and silver standards could provide monetary stability while accommodating the practical needs of a developing economy with limited precious metal supplies. Hamilton's bimetallic system allowed both gold and silver coins to serve as legal money, providing flexibility while maintaining precious metal backing. The ratio between gold and silver that Hamilton established reflected careful analysis of international precious metal markets, but this fixed ratio created ongoing problems as market conditions changed. When the market ratio between gold and silver deviated from the legal ratio, profitable metal exported the undervalued metal while importing the overvalued metal, disrupting domestic money supplies. The First Bank of the United States, 1791 to 1811, provided institutional mechanisms for managing monetary policy within the constraints of precious metal standards, but political opposition to centralized banking reflected broader American suspicion of financial institutions and monetary arrangements that seemed to favor creditor interests over debtor needs. The War of 1812 forced temporary suspension of gold convertibility as government spending exceeded tax revenues while trade disruptions reduced customs income. This experience demonstrated how military emergencies could make gold standard operations impossible, while illustrating the fiscal discipline that gold convertibility normally imposed on government policy. The Second Bank of the United States, 1816 to 1836, represented American adaptation of British central banking practices to domestic political and economic conditions. Nicholas Biddle's management of the bank demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how central banking could support economic stability while maintaining gold convertibility, but political opposition from Andrew Jackson reflected broader democratic hostility to concentrated financial power. Jackson's destruction of the Second Bank in 1836 reflected fundamental American ambivalence about the constraints that sound money principles imposed on democratic governance. Jackson's preference for hard money appealed to farmers and workers who blamed banks for economic instability, while his opposition to paper currency reflected belief that only precious metals constituted legitimate money. The free banking era, 1837 to 1863, demonstrated both the possibilities and problems inherent in decentralized monetary systems based on precious metal reserves. State-chartered banks issued notes backed by gold and silver, creating competitive monetary systems that provided flexibility while maintaining precious metal discipline. The proliferation of different banknotes during the free banking era created practical problems for commerce while illustrating the advantages of uniform national currency. Merchants and consumers faced constant uncertainty about the value and acceptability of different banks' notes, while counterfeiting and bank failures created additional risks for money users. The California gold rush of 1849 provided a natural experiment in how gold discoveries affected monetary systems and economic development. The massive influx of California gold increased American money supplies while demonstrating how precious metal discoveries could stimulate economic activity through increased purchasing power, investment capital. The inflation that followed the California gold rush illustrated how gold-based monetary systems were not immune to price instability when precious metal supplies changed rapidly. However, the inflation was moderate and temporary compared to the devastating price increases that would characterize later periods of pure paper money. The Civil War forced complete abandonment of gold convertibility as government spending requirements far exceeded any possible tax revenues or borrowing capacity that gold-backed currency could provide. The issuance of greenbacks represented America's first experiment with pure fiat currency, creating unprecedented inflation while demonstrating the fiscal advantages of unconstrained money creation. Post-war resumption of gold convertibility in 1879 required severe fiscal discipline and economic adjustment that imposed significant hardships on debtors, while demonstrating the government's Commitment to sound money principles. The deflationary period between 1865 and 1879 reduced prices back to pre-war levels while restoring international confidence in American currency. The Gilded Age economic expansion, 1879 to 1896, demonstrated how gold standard operations could support rapid industrial development and economic growth while maintaining price stability and currency credibility. American economic growth during this period was unprecedented in its scale and duration, while price levels remained remarkably stable. The silver movement of the 1880s and 1890s reflected ongoing political tensions between sound money principles and demands for monetary expansion that would benefit farmers and debtors. Silver advocates argued that returning to bimetallic standards would increase money supplies while maintaining precious metal backing, but gold advocates warned that silver inflation would destroy currency credibility. The Panic of 1893 demonstrated how gold standard operations could impose severe constraints during financial crises, as gold outflows forced monetary contraction that deepened economic depression. However, the crisis also illustrated how sound money principles eventually restored confidence and economic stability without permanent institutional damage. William Jennings Bryan's Cross of Gold speech in 1896 articulated the most powerful political challenge to gold standard orthodoxy, arguing that monetary policy should serve the interests of workers and farmers rather than creditors and financiers. Bryan's defeat in the presidential election demonstrated that American voters ultimately preferred monetary stability to inflationary monetary expansion. The establishment of the American gold standard on a permanent basis after 1896 reflected both the success of gold-based monetary policy and the political victory of sound money advocates over inflationists. American commitment to gold convertibility provided the monetary foundation for the country's emergence as a major industrial and financial power. The period between 1896 and 1914 represented the American gold standard's golden age, when monetary stability combined with rapid economic growth to create unprecedented prosperity, while establishing the United States as a major player in international finance and commerce. American mastery of gold standard operations enabled the country to attract massive foreign investment while developing domestic financial markets that could compete with London for international business. The combination of sound money and rapid economic growth created the foundations for America's emergence as a world power. However, the success of American gold standard operations also created the economic strength that would eventually enable the United States to abandon gold-based monetary policy when political circumstances made such constraints seem intolerable to democratic governance and economic management. Global dominance. The period between 1870 and 1914 represented the gold standard's greatest triumph, as virtually every major economy adopted gold-based monetary systems that created the first truly integrated global economy, with unprecedented levels of international trade, capital mobility, and economic coordination that enabled the greatest period of economic growth and development in human history. The network effects that drove global gold standard adoption reflected the practical advantages that standardized monetary systems provided for international commerce. As more countries adopted gold-based currencies, the benefits of gold standard membership increased for remaining countries, creating powerful incentives for universal participation in gold-based monetary arrangements. German adoption of the gold standard in 1871 following unification demonstrated how emerging industrial powers recognized that gold-based monetary credibility was essential for international economic competition. The German mark's gold backing enabled Germany to attract international investment while supporting the industrial development that would challenge British economic dominance. The Latin Monetary Union, 1865 to 1927, represented an ambitious attempt to create monetary integration based on shared gold and silver standards, demonstrating both the possibilities and limitations of international monetary cooperation. France, Belgium, Italy, and Switzerland agreed to standardize their coinage while maintaining separate currencies tied to common precious metal standards. Russia's adoption of the gold standard in 1897 under Finance Minister Sergei Witte demonstrated how even relatively backward economies could benefit from gold standard credibility. The Russian ruble's gold backing attracted massive foreign investment that financed railroad construction and industrial development, transforming the Russian economy within a generation. Japan's adoption of the gold standard in 1897 reflected the country's recognition that monetary credibility was essential for achieving international recognition and economic development. The yen's gold backing enabled Japan to access international capital markets while supporting the military and industrial development that would make Japan a major world power. The complexity of managing international gold flows required sophisticated understanding of balance of payments dynamics and monetary policy coordination that pushed central banking practices toward greater sophistication and international cooperation. Central bankers developed informal networks for sharing information and coordinating policies that maintained system stability. International arbitrage operations based on gold standard relationships created automatic mechanisms for correcting trade imbalances and currency misalignments that maintained system equilibria without requiring government intervention or international negotiations. These market-based adjustment mechanisms provided stability while preserving national sovereignty over economic policy. The price-specie flow mechanism identified by David Hume in the 18th century operated automatically under gold standard conditions, as trade surpluses led to gold inflows that expanded money supplies and raised prices, while trade deficits caused gold outflows that contracted money supplies and reduced prices, automatically correcting trade imbalances over time. International investment flows reached unprecedented levels as gold standard credibility eliminated currency risk, while creating common standards for evaluating investment opportunities across different countries. British capital financed railroad construction throughout the world, while French investors funded Russian industrialization and German entrepreneurs developed American manufacturing. The London money market's role as the center of international finance reflected Britain's leadership in gold standard operations, but competition from other gold standard countries gradually created alternative financial centers that could provide similar services. Paris, Berlin, and New York emerged as major financial centers that challenged London's dominance. Commodity price stability under the gold standard enabled long-term planning and investment that would have been impossible under more volatile monetary arrangements. Agricultural and industrial producers could plan production and investment with confidence that prices would remain relatively stable, encouraging capital formation and technological innovation. International trade growth during the gold standard era was unprecedented, as stable exchange rates and universal currency acceptability eliminated many of the risks and uncertainties that had previously constrained international commerce. Trade volumes increased by over 300% between 1870 and 1914, while transportation costs declined due to technological improvements. Migration flows were facilitated by gold standard operations that enabled workers to earn wages in one country while supporting families in another, as currency stability made international remittances practical and reliable. Millions of Europeans migrated to North and South America while maintaining financial connections to their home countries. Technological innovation was encouraged by the long-term investment planning that monetary stability made possible. Inventors and entrepreneurs could develop new technologies, knowing that successful innovations would generate predictable returns in stable currency, leading to unprecedented rates of technological progress across multiple industries. The development of international financial instruments reflected the sophistication that gold standard operations enabled. International bonds, letters of credit, and insurance contracts became standard tools for managing international business relationships while spreading risks across multiple markets and institutions. Imperial finance systems demonstrated how gold standard principles could support political relationships while encouraging economic development. Colonial territories could access metropolitan capital markets because their currencies were tied to gold, while imperial powers could finance territorial development with confidence in future returns. The international telegraph network that developed during this period was crucial for gold standard operations, as rapid communication enabled arbitrage operations and international financial coordination that maintained system stability. Information flows became as important as gold flows for maintaining international monetary equilibrium. Banking relationships became increasingly international, as gold standard operations required institutions that could operate across multiple countries and currencies. International banking houses developed sophisticated capabilities for managing foreign exchange, international payments, and cross-border lending that supported global commerce. Government debt markets became truly international, as gold standard credibility enabled countries to borrow from foreign investors with confidence that repayment obligations would remain stable, regardless of domestic political or economic changes. This international capital mobility enabled governments to finance infrastructure development and military modernization. Insurance markets developed international scope as gold standard stability made long-term contracts practical across different countries and political systems. Marine insurance, in particular, became a sophisticated international industry that enabled global shipping and trade by providing protection against the risks inherent in long-distance commerce. The cultural and intellectual exchange that accompanied economic integration under the gold standard created the cosmopolitan civilization that characterized the pre-1914 period. Ideas, technologies, and innovations spread rapidly across national boundaries, creating an integrated global culture that supported further economic development. However, the success of the international gold standard also created the economic interdependence and competitive pressures that would contribute to the political tensions and military conflicts that would ultimately destroy the system that had created unprecedented global prosperity and cooperation. The outbreak of World War I in August 1914 shattered the international gold standard overnight, as governments faced military expenditures that exceeded any possible level of taxation or borrowing that gold-backed currencies could support, forcing the suspension of gold convertibility that would mark the beginning of the end for the world's oldest and most successful monetary system. The immediate crisis began when international financial markets collapsed, as investors scrambled to convert securities and foreign currencies into gold, creating massive capital flows that threatened to drain national gold reserves within days. The Bank of England, which had maintained gold convertibility for nearly a century, found itself facing gold outflows that would have exhausted its reserves within weeks. Britain's suspension of gold convertibility on August 6, 1914, represented one of the most dramatic policy reversals in financial history, as the country that had created and led the international gold standard abandoned the principles that had made London the world's financial capital. The suspension was presented as a temporary wartime measure, but it marked the beginning of fundamental changes in monetary systems worldwide. Germany's abandonment of gold convertibility reflected similar pressures, as the government recognized that financing military operations would require money creation on a scale that gold reserves could never support. The German decision to issue war bonds and paper currency marked the beginning of inflationary finance that would ultimately destroy the German economy. France suspended gold convertibility while implementing exchange controls that restricted international capital movements, demonstrating how war conditions made the international financial integration that had characterized the gold standard era impossible to maintain. The French experience illustrated how military necessities overrode economic principles. Russia's monetary collapse during the war provided an extreme example of how military spending could destroy established monetary systems. The Russian government printed rubles to finance military operations, creating hyperinflation that contributed to revolutionary conditions and the eventual collapse of the Tsarist regime. Austria-Hungary's monetary disintegration reflected both military pressures and the political fragmentation that war created within multi-ethnic empires. Different regions within the empire began issuing separate currencies, while inflation destroyed the crown's purchasing power and contributed to political disintegration. The United States maintained gold convertibility longer than European belligerents because of its initial neutrality, but American entry into the war in 1917 required massive government spending that would have been impossible under strict gold standard constraints. The Federal Reserve's expansion of credit and money supplies marked America's effective departure from gold standard principles. War bond financing represented governments' attempts to raise money without explicit monetary expansion, but the scale of borrowing required exceeded domestic savings capacity, forcing central banks to purchase government securities with newly created money. This indirect money creation had the same inflationary effects as direct currency printing while maintaining the appearance of sound finance. The Liberty Bond campaigns in the United States demonstrated how governments mobilized public savings for war finance, but even massive voluntary lending was insufficient to cover military costs. The Federal Reserve's purchases of government securities created the money supply expansion that financed American military spending while generating the inflation that eroded gold standard principles. Industrial mobilization required government control over resource allocation and production that was incompatible with market-based gold standard operations. Price controls, rationing, and production quotas replaced market mechanisms, while government spending displaced private investment in ways that fundamentally altered economic relationships. International trade collapsed as governments restricted exports of strategic materials while submarine warfare disrupted shipping routes. The breakdown of international commerce eliminated many of the practical benefits that gold standard operations had provided, reducing the system's political support, even among traditional gold standard advocates. Labor market disruptions created by military conscription and industrial mobilization required government intervention that was incompatible with gold standard constraints on government policy. Wage controls, labor allocation, and social welfare programs expanded government responsibilities in ways that required monetary flexibility. Central bank cooperation that had maintained international gold standard stability broke down as national governments demanded that monetary policy serve military rather than international objectives. The informal networks of central bank coordination that had supported the international gold standard were replaced by national monetary policies designed to support war efforts. Inflation became unavoidable as governments chose monetary expansion over the fiscal discipline that gold convertibility would have required. The price increases that resulted from wartime monetary policies violated the price stability that had been one of the gold standard's primary advantages, undermining public support for return to gold-based monetary systems. Post-war reconstruction needs created additional pressures for monetary expansion that made return to pre-war gold standard operations extremely difficult. The physical destruction, debt burdens, and social welfare demands that resulted from the war required government spending and monetary policies that gold standard constraints would have made impossible. International debt relationships created by inter-allied lending during the war complicated efforts to restore gold standard operations, as debtor countries lacked the gold reserves necessary to service obligations while maintaining domestic monetary stability. War debt payments conflicted with gold standard requirements for balanced international accounts. Territorial changes and new nation-states that emerged from the war lacked the institutional experience and gold reserves necessary for gold standard operations. Countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia needed to establish new monetary systems while dealing with war damage and political instability that made sound money policies extremely difficult. Social and political changes that resulted from the war created demands for government economic intervention that were incompatible with gold standard constraints on fiscal and monetary policy. Democratic expansion, labor organization, and social welfare expectations required government capabilities that gold standard operations would have prevented. The Russian Revolution and subsequent communist policies demonstrated how political upheavals could eliminate the institutional foundations that gold standard operations required. The Bolshevik repudiation of Tsarist debts and abolition of private property destroyed the legal and financial relationships that had supported international monetary cooperation. Hyperinflation in Germany during the early 1920s provided a dramatic illustration of how abandoning sound money principles could lead to complete monetary collapse. The Weimar Republic's decision to finance reparation payments and government operations through money printing created the most severe inflation in modern history, while demonstrating the importance of monetary discipline. The war's economic and political consequences created conditions that made restoration of the pre-1914 gold standard impossible, while the institutional precedents established by wartime government intervention created expectations for continued government economic management that would shape monetary policy for decades. Restoration attempts. The international effort to restore the gold standard during the 1920s represented one of the most ambitious attempts at institutional reconstruction in economic history, as policymakers sought to recreate the monetary stability and international cooperation that had enabled pre-war prosperity while dealing with the economic, political, and social changes that the war had created. Britain's return to gold convertibility in 1925 at the pre-war parity represented both the symbolism and the practical difficulties involved in gold standard restoration. Chancellor Winston Churchill's decision to restore the pound's pre-war gold value was intended to re-establish London's position as the world's financial capital, but the overvalued exchange rate created competitive disadvantages for British industry. The economic consequences of Britain's return to gold at the pre-war parity included chronic unemployment, industrial decline, and social unrest that culminated in the General Strike of 1926. British workers and manufacturers bore the costs of maintaining currency overvaluation that benefited financial interests while imposing hardships on the real economy. John Maynard Keynes's opposition to the return to gold at pre-war parity provided the most sophisticated critique of restoration policies, arguing that changed economic conditions made pre-war exchange rates inappropriate, while highlighting the domestic costs of maintaining international monetary commitments that conflicted with full employment objectives. The United States maintained gold convertibility throughout the 1920s, while experiencing unprecedented economic prosperity that seemed to validate gold standard operations. American industrial productivity growth, consumer spending expansion, and stock market appreciation appeared to demonstrate that gold-based monetary systems remained compatible with modern economic development. However, American gold standard operations during the 1920s included monetary policies that violated classical gold standard principles, as the Federal Reserve actively managed money supplies and interest rates rather than allowing automatic gold flow mechanisms to determine monetary conditions. This managed gold standard represented a fundamental departure from traditional practices. The Federal Reserve's monetary policies during the 1920s reflected attempts to achieve domestic economic objectives while maintaining gold convertibility. But this dual mandate created contradictions that would ultimately prove unsustainable. The Fed's efforts to promote domestic prosperity while maintaining international monetary stability required policy compromises that satisfied neither objective fully. Germany's monetary stabilization following the hyperinflation crisis demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of gold standard restoration. The creation of the Rentenmark in 1923 and its subsequent replacement by the gold-backed Reichsmark restored monetary stability while enabling economic recovery, but the German economy remained vulnerable to international capital flow disruptions. The Dawes Plan of 1924 represented international recognition that German reparation payments and gold standard operations were incompatible, as the plan restructured payment schedules while providing American loans that enabled Germany to maintain gold convertibility. This arrangement created artificial stability that depended on continued American lending. France's return to gold in 1928, at a deliberately undervalued exchange rate, demonstrated how countries could use gold standard restoration to gain competitive advantages rather than simply recreating pre-war conditions. The undervalued franc stimulated French exports while attracting gold inflows that strengthened France's international position. The asymmetric nature of gold standard restoration, with some countries maintaining overvalued currencies while others adopted undervalued rates, created international tensions and imbalances that undermined the system's long-term viability. These exchange rate misalignments generated trade conflicts and capital flow instabilities that traditional gold standard mechanisms couldn't correct. Central bank cooperation during the 1920s attempted to recreate the informal coordination that had maintained pre-war stability, but political pressures and domestic policy objectives limited central bankers' ability to subordinate national interests to international monetary requirements. The restoration of central bank independence was incomplete and politically vulnerable. International lending during the 1920s, particularly American loans to Germany, created artificial stability that masked fundamental problems with gold standard restoration. The circular flow of American loans to Germany, German reparation payments to Britain and France, and Allied war debt payments to the United States created unsustainable financial relationships. The Young Plan of 1929 represented a final attempt to make German reparations compatible with gold standard operations, but the plan's reduced payment schedules and extended timetables reflected recognition that the original reparation demands were unrealistic. However, even the reduced obligations proved unsustainable when international conditions deteriorated. Stock market speculation during the late 1920s created tensions between gold standard requirements and domestic monetary policy objectives. As the Federal Reserve faced conflicting pressures to maintain gold convertibility while restraining speculative excess, the Fed's inability to resolve these tensions contributed to both speculative bubbles and subsequent monetary contraction. International capital flows during the Restoration period were more volatile and politically sensitive than pre-war movements, as investors and governments had learned that exchange rates and monetary policies could change rapidly. This increased sensitivity created instabilities that traditional gold standard mechanisms couldn't manage effectively. The political foundations for gold standard operations were weaker during the 1920s than before 1914, as democratic expansion, labor organization, and social welfare expectations created demands for government economic intervention that conflicted with gold standard constraints on fiscal and monetary policy. Labor market conditions during the Restoration period reflected the tensions between international monetary commitments and domestic employment objectives. Countries maintaining overvalued currencies experienced chronic unemployment, while those with undervalued currencies enjoyed competitive advantages that generated international tensions. Agricultural problems during the 1920s demonstrated how gold standard deflation could create severe hardships for particular sectors, while illustrating the political difficulties of maintaining monetary policies that imposed concentrated costs on specific groups. Farm debt problems and commodity price declines created political opposition to deflationary monetary policies. International trade growth during the Restoration period was slower and more unstable than before 1914, as political tensions, trade restrictions, and exchange rate uncertainties created obstacles to the international economic integration that had characterized the classical gold standard era. The fragility of restored gold standard operations became apparent during the stock market crash of 1929, as the international transmission of financial instability demonstrated how integrated monetary systems could spread crises while limiting individual countries' ability to respond with independent monetary policies. By 1929, the contradictions between gold standard constraints and modern economic policy objectives had created unstable conditions that would make the system vulnerable to any significant shock, setting the stage for the collapse that would follow the onset of the Great Depression. Great Depression. The Great Depression of the 1930s represented the gold standard's final crisis, as the monetary constraints imposed by gold convertibility transformed a severe but manageable economic downturn into the worst economic catastrophe in modern history. ultimately forcing governments to choose between maintaining gold-backed currencies and addressing mass unemployment and economic collapse. The stock market crash of October 1929 initiated a deflationary spiral that gold standard operations amplified rather than corrected, as falling prices increased real debt burdens while gold outflows from deficit countries forced monetary contraction that deepened economic decline. The automatic adjustment mechanisms that had maintained stability during previous crises proved inadequate for the scale of disruption that characterized the 1930s depression. International transmission of the economic crisis through gold standard relationships demonstrated how monetary integration that had facilitated prosperity during good times became a mechanism for spreading economic devastation during bad times. Countries maintaining gold convertibility could not insulate themselves from international deflationary pressures, while coordinated monetary expansion was impossible under gold standard constraints. Britain's abandonment of the gold standard in September 1931 marked the beginning of the international monetary system's collapse, as the country that had created and led the gold standard chose domestic economic recovery over international monetary commitments. The pound's devaluation provided immediate competitive relief while freeing British monetary policy from gold standard constraints. The sterling bloc countries that followed Britain off gold demonstrated how political and economic relationships could override pure monetary considerations, as countries within Britain's sphere of influence chose to maintain currency links with London rather than remain on gold with other countries. Germany's introduction of exchange controls and bilateral trade agreements represented an alternative to gold standard abandonment that maintained currency stability while restricting international capital movements. The German approach demonstrated how authoritarian governments could maintain exchange rate stability through administrative controls rather than market mechanisms. The United States maintained gold convertibility longer than most other countries despite experiencing severe economic decline, as political and ideological commitments to sound money principles prevented policy responses that might have addressed deflationary pressures more effectively. American adherence to gold standard principles prolonged and deepened domestic economic suffering. Banking crises during the early 1930s were exacerbated by gold standard constraints that prevented central banks from acting as lenders of last resort without threatening gold reserves. The Federal Reserve's inability to prevent bank failures reflected the conflict between domestic financial stability and international monetary commitments. Agricultural devastation during the Depression illustrated how gold standard deflation imposed particularly severe hardships on commodity producers, as falling prices increased real debt burdens while making agricultural production unprofitable. Farm foreclosures and rural poverty demonstrated the social costs of maintaining deflationary monetary policies. International debt defaults reflected the impossibility of servicing fixed obligations when deflation increased real debt burdens while reducing debtors' ability to earn foreign exchange. The breakdown of international lending relationships eliminated one of the key benefits that gold standard operations had provided during the pre-war period. The tariff wars that developed during the early 1930s demonstrated how countries attempted to protect domestic industries and employment while maintaining gold convertibility. But these trade restrictions reduced international commerce and eliminated many of the efficiency gains that free trade under gold standard operations had previously provided. Political radicalization in countries maintaining gold standard deflation provided dramatic evidence of how monetary constraints could undermine democratic stability. The rise of extremist movements in Germany and other countries reflected public frustration with economic policies that seemed to prioritize monetary principles over human welfare. France's maintenance of gold convertibility until 1936 illustrated both the costs and the political limits of gold standard orthodoxy. The French experience with prolonged deflation, rising unemployment, and social unrest demonstrated that even countries with strong institutional commitments to sound money principles could not indefinitely ignore domestic political pressures. Central bank cooperation during the crisis proved inadequate for addressing international coordination problems that gold standard operations created. The Bank for International Settlements, established in 1930 to facilitate central bank cooperation, could not overcome the fundamental conflicts between domestic policy objectives and international monetary commitments. The philosophical debate between defenders of gold standard orthodoxy and advocates of monetary expansion revealed fundamental disagreements about the proper relationship between monetary policy, economic management. Gold standard advocates argued that deflation was necessary for correcting economic imbalances, while critics contended that monetary flexibility was essential for economic recovery. Liquidity traps that characterized many economies during the Depression demonstrated how deflationary conditions could make monetary policy ineffective even when central banks attempted to stimulate economic activity. Interest rates at or near zero provided little scope for further monetary stimulus, while debt deflation continued to worsen economic conditions. International migration patterns during the Depression reflected how economic nationalism and trade restrictions undermined the global labor mobility that had characterized the classical gold standard era. Immigration restrictions and repatriation programs reduced the international labor market integration that had previously facilitated economic adjustment. Corporate bankruptcies and industrial decline during the Depression illustrated how deflation could destroy productive capacity while creating unemployment that persisted long after economic recovery began. The destruction of industrial capacity represented permanent losses that undermined future economic potential. Social welfare demands that emerged during the crisis created political pressures for government spending that was incompatible with gold standard fiscal constraints. Democratic governments faced impossible choices between maintaining sound money principles and addressing the social problems that economic collapse had created. The intellectual revolution that accompanied the Depression's economic crisis included fundamental reconsideration of monetary theory and policy principles that had supported gold standard operations. For centuries, economists and policymakers began questioning whether automatic monetary mechanisms could provide adequate economic management for modern industrial societies. Regional variations in economic performance during the Depression demonstrated how countries that abandoned gold standard constraints earliest experienced faster recovery, while those maintaining gold convertibility longest suffered prolonged economic decline. These policy experiments provided evidence about the costs and benefits of different monetary arrangements. By 1936, the accumulated evidence of economic suffering, political instability, and international conflict had discredited gold standard orthodoxy while creating political support for monetary policies that prioritized domestic employment and economic stability over international monetary commitments. The stage was set for fundamental changes in monetary institutions and economic policy approaches. Roosevelt's Revolution. Franklin Roosevelt's monetary policies between 1933 and 1939 represented the most radical transformation of American financial institutions since the Constitution's adoption, as the New Deal dismantled the gold standard's domestic operations while creating new mechanisms for government economic management that fundamentally altered the relationship between money, banking, and federal authority. Roosevelt's bank holiday, proclaimed on March 6, 1933, provided the political cover necessary for implementing monetary policies that would have been impossible under normal democratic procedures. The emergency closure of all banks enabled the administration to restructure the entire banking system while preparing public opinion for the dramatic monetary changes that would follow. The Emergency Banking Act of March 9, 1933, demonstrated how crisis conditions could enable rapid institutional change that would have required years of political debate under normal circumstances. The act gave the president unprecedented authority over banking and currency, while providing the legal framework for abandoning gold standard constraints on monetary policy. Executive Order 6102, issued on April 5, 1933, required Americans to surrender gold coins and bullion to the government, effectively ending the domestic gold standard while concentrating gold ownership in federal hands. This confiscation represented one of the most dramatic property seizures in American history, accomplished through presidential decree rather than legislative process. The devaluation of the dollar against gold from $20.67 to $35 per ounce represented a 69% currency depreciation that immediately reduced the real value of debts while increasing the nominal value of government gold reserves. This devaluation demonstrated how governments could use monetary policy to redistribute wealth between creditors and debtors through currency manipulation. The Gold Reserve Act of 1934 formalized the government's monopoly over gold ownership, while establishing the Exchange Stabilization Fund that provided Treasury officials with unprecedented authority to intervene in foreign exchange markets. These provisions created institutional capabilities for monetary management that had never existed under gold standard operations. Thomas' amendment to the Agricultural Adjustment Act provided Roosevelt with multiple options for monetary expansion, including authority to issue greenbacks, remonetize silver, and devalue the dollar by up to 50%. This legislative framework demonstrated Congress's willingness to abandon gold standard constraints in favor of presidential discretion over monetary policy. The RFC's Reconstruction Finance Corporation expansion under Jesse Jones illustrated how government lending could substitute for private banking functions while providing political authorities with direct control over credit allocation. The RFC's operations represented a fundamental departure from market-based financial systems toward politically directed capital allocation. Securities regulation through the SEC represented recognition that financial market operations required government oversight that had been unnecessary under gold standard discipline. The Securities Act of 1933 and Securities Exchange Act of 1934 created regulatory frameworks that replaced market discipline with administrative supervision. Banking regulation through the FDIC and revised Federal Reserve authorities demonstrated how abandoning gold standard constraints required new institutional mechanisms for maintaining financial stability. Deposit insurance eliminated market discipline over bank risk-taking, while expanding Federal Reserve Authority enabled more active monetary management. The National Recovery Administration's price-fixing and production control represented the most comprehensive peacetime government intervention in market operations in American history. The NRA's codes demonstrated how abandoning monetary constraints enabled direct government control over economic relationships that gold standard operations had left to market forces. Agricultural policies, including crop destruction and acreage reduction, illustrated how government could manipulate supply conditions to achieve political objectives that market forces would not have supported. The AAA's operations demonstrated the economic possibilities that unlimited government spending could provide, while ignoring efficiency considerations. Social Security and unemployment insurance programs represented permanent expansions of federal responsibility for individual economic welfare that would have been impossible under gold standard. Fiscal constraints. These programs created ongoing spending obligations that required permanent access to money creation rather than balanced budgets. Labor legislation, including the Wagner Act, demonstrated how abandoning gold standard discipline enabled government intervention in wage determination and working conditions that market forces had previously controlled. The expansion of federal labor regulation represented fundamental changes in the relationship between government and private employment. Public works programs, including the WPA and CCC, demonstrated how government could create employment directly rather than relying on private sector recovery that gold standard operations would have required. These programs represented unprecedented peacetime government involvement in labor market operations. Regional development programs, including the TVA, illustrated how government could reshape economic geography through investments that private markets would not have undertaken under gold standard constraints. The TVA represented comprehensive government planning that replaced market-based resource allocation with political decision-making. International monetary policy during the New Deal period included competitive devaluation and trade restrictions that violated the international cooperation principles that had supported gold standard operations. Roosevelt's policies prioritized domestic recovery over international monetary stability. The court-packing controversy of 1937 demonstrated how constitutional constraints could limit presidential authority over economic policy, but Roosevelt's eventual success in placing supported justices on the Supreme Court removed judicial obstacles to expanded government economic powers that gold standard abandonment had made possible. Keynesian economics provided intellectual justification for the government economic management that gold standard abandonment enabled, arguing that market economies required active government intervention to maintain full employment and economic stability. Keynesian theory replaced classical economics as the foundation for government policy. Monetary theory during the New Deal period evolved to support discretionary government management rather than automatic gold standard operations. As economists developed arguments for active monetary policy that could address economic fluctuations through central bank intervention rather than market forces. The recession of 1937 to 1938 demonstrated how government policies could create economic instability even under flexible monetary arrangements. But Roosevelt's response involved further government spending rather than return to gold standard discipline. The episode illustrated how abandoning gold constraints created both opportunities and risks for economic management. Business opposition to New Deal policies reflected traditional American support for market-based economic systems, but Roosevelt's political success demonstrated public support for government economic intervention that gold standard operations would have prevented. The New Deal created lasting political coalitions that supported expanded federal economic authority. By 1939, Roosevelt's monetary revolution had created institutional foundations for government economic management that would persist long after the immediate crisis had passed. The abandonment of gold standard constraints had enabled fundamental changes in American political economy that would shape government policy for generations. Bretton Woods. The Bretton Woods Conference of July 1944 represented the most ambitious attempt at international monetary reconstruction in history, as 44 nations gathered in New Hampshire to design a new global financial system that would provide the stability and predictability of the gold standard while accommodating the expanded government responsibilities and economic management capability that the war had created. The intellectual framework for Bretton Woods reflected the work of John Maynard Keynes and Harry Dexter White, whose competing visions for post-war monetary arrangements shared recognition that the classical gold standard's automatic mechanisms were incompatible with modern democratic governments' commitments to full employment and social welfare, while maintaining that some form of international monetary discipline was necessary for global economic stability. Keynes's proposal for an international clearing union represented the most sophisticated alternative to gold-based monetary systems ever developed, featuring a new international currency called Bancor that would be used for international transactions while enabling countries to maintain domestic monetary autonomy. The Keynes plan would have created automatic mechanisms for correcting trade imbalances without requiring deflationary adjustment by deficit countries. White's proposal for an international monetary fund reflected American preferences for maintaining dollar-based international monetary arrangements while providing institutional mechanisms for international cooperation and adjustment assistance. The White Plan emphasized maintaining fixed exchange rates and convertibility while providing financing for temporary balance of payments difficulties. The compromise that emerged from Bretton Woods negotiations created a gold exchange standard that maintained gold's role as the ultimate international monetary anchor while making the dollar the primary international currency for trade and finance. This arrangement reflected American economic dominance while attempting to recreate the stability that gold standard operations had provided. The International Monetary Fund's creation represented institutionalization of international monetary cooperation that had operated through informal central bank networks under the classical gold standard. The IMF's lending facilities provided financing for countries experiencing balance of payments difficulties while imposing policy conditions designed to correct underlying imbalances. The World Bank's establishment demonstrated recognition that post-war reconstruction and economic development would require international capital flows on a scale that private markets might not provide, while the institution's structure reflected American preferences for multilateral rather than bilateral development assistance programs. Fixed exchange rate commitments under Bretton Woods attempted to recreate the predictability and stability that gold standard operations had provided for international trade and investment, while the adjustable peg mechanism recognized that changed economic conditions might require exchange rate modifications that pure gold standard operations would not have permitted. The dollar's role as the primary reserve currency reflected American economic strength and credibility while creating what economists later called the Triffin dilemma, the inherent contradiction between providing adequate international liquidity and maintaining confidence in the reserve currency's gold convertibility. American gold reserves that backed the dollar's international role seemed adequate when the Bretton Woods system was established, but the system's operation would require constant dollar creation that would eventually exceed the gold backing necessary to maintain credibility among international monetary authorities. Capital controls that most countries maintained under Bretton Woods reflected recognition that fixed exchange rates were incompatible with free capital mobility, representing a fundamental difference from the classical gold standard period when capital flowed freely across international boundaries while exchange rates remained stable through gold standard mechanisms. Trade liberalization through the GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, complemented Bretton Woods monetary arrangements by reducing trade barriers while maintaining exchange rate stability. But the combination of fixed exchange rates and trade liberalization created pressures that would eventually make the system unsustainable. European recovery programs, including the Marshall Plan, demonstrated how international monetary cooperation could support economic reconstruction, but American aid programs also created dollar outflows that began reducing the U.S. gold reserves that backed the international monetary system's credibility. The European Payments Union represented regional monetary cooperation that operated within the broader Bretton Woods framework, while demonstrating how countries could create alternative payment mechanisms that reduced dependence on dollar settlements and gold transfers. Devaluation crises during the 1950s and 1960s illustrated how the adjustable peg mechanism could create speculative pressures that overwhelmed government reserves, as investors learned to anticipate exchange rate changes while official policy commitments created one-way bets that made speculation profitable and virtually risk-free. The sterling crisis of 1967 demonstrated how even major currencies could face overwhelming speculative pressure under Bretton Woods arrangements, as investors bet against official exchange rate commitments, while governments lacked adequate reserves to defend unrealistic exchange rate levels against market forces. Euro-dollar market development represented private sector adaptation to Bretton Woods constraints and opportunities, as banks and multinational corporations created offshore dollar markets that enabled international financial operations while avoiding domestic regulatory restrictions and capital controls. International banking expansion during the Bretton Woods period reflected the opportunities that fixed exchange rates and growing international trade created for financial institutions. But this expansion also created the international financial relationships that would transmit instability when the system eventually collapsed. Central bank cooperation under Bretton Woods involved more formal and institutionalized coordination than the informal networks that had supported the classical gold standard. But political pressures and conflicting domestic policy objectives limited central bankers' ability to subordinate national interests to international monetary stability requirements. Inflation acceleration during the 1960s reflected the monetary expansion that Bretton Woods arrangements enabled, as countries could maintain artificially low interest rates and expansionary fiscal policies while fixed exchange rates prevented the immediate consequences that gold standard discipline would have imposed. Vietnam War financing demonstrated how Bretton Woods arrangements enabled governments to conduct military operations that would have been impossible under gold standard fiscal constraints. But the monetary expansion required to finance military spending created inflationary pressures that undermined system credibility. Balance of payments deficits that characterized American international accounts during the 1960s reflected both the system's operation as intended, providing international liquidity through dollar creation, and the fundamental contradiction that would eventually destroy the system's credibility and force its abandonment. By 1970, the contradictions inherent in Bretton Woods arrangements had created conditions that made the system's continuation impossible, as speculative pressures against the dollar's gold convertibility exceeded the American government's ability to maintain the gold backing that provided the system's ultimate foundation. Nixon shock. The weekend meeting at Camp David on August 13, 1971, where President Nixon and his economic advisors decided to suspend the dollar's convertibility to gold, represented one of the most consequential economic policy decisions in human history, ending the last connection between money and gold, while launching the world into an unprecedented experiment with purely fiat currencies. The immediate crisis that precipitated Nixon's decision reflected the fundamental contradictions inherent in the Bretton Woods system, as mounting American balance of payments deficits had created more dollars in foreign hands than the US gold reserves could support, while foreign governments began demanding gold conversion that threatened to exhaust American gold holdings within months. French pressure for gold conversion under President Charles de Gaulle had exposed the system's fundamental weakness, as de Gaulle explicitly criticized what he called the exorbitant privilege that enabled Americans to finance international deficits with their own currency, while other countries needed to earn dollars or gold through trade surpluses. The London gold pool's collapse in 1968 had demonstrated that market forces could overwhelm government attempts to maintain artificial gold prices, as private demand for gold at the official price of $35 per ounce exceeded central bank supplies, while creating two-tier gold markets that separated official monetary gold from private market gold. Treasury Secretary John Connally's influence on Nixon's decision reflected the administration's prioritization of domestic political objectives over international monetary commitments, as Connally argued that maintaining gold convertibility was less important than addressing American unemployment and trade deficits through more flexible economic policies. Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns's reluctant support for gold convertibility suspension illustrated how even traditional central bankers recognized that domestic economic objectives had become incompatible with international monetary constraints that limited policy flexibility during periods of economic difficulty. The surprise announcement on Sunday evening, August 15, 1971, was designed to prevent speculative attacks on the dollar before policy changes could be implemented, but the dramatic nature of the announcement shocked international allies who had not been consulted about decisions that would fundamentally alter global monetary arrangements. The temporary nature of Nixon's suspension, initially presented as a 90-day measure while international negotiations addressed exchange rate and trade imbalances, reflected either genuine belief that gold convertibility could be restored or political recognition that permanent abandonment would be difficult to justify to domestic and international audiences. International reaction to Nixon's decision ranged from shock to anger, as Allied governments found themselves holding dollars that could no longer be converted to gold while facing the prospect of fundamental changes in monetary arrangements that had supported post-war economic development and international cooperation. The import surcharge and wage price freeze that accompanied gold suspension demonstrated how abandoning monetary constraints enabled comprehensive government intervention in market operations that would have been impossible under gold standard discipline. These policies represented the most extensive peacetime economic controls in American history. Exchange rate volatility that followed gold suspension illustrated the challenges of maintaining international monetary stability without gold anchors, as currency values fluctuated wildly, while governments attempted to negotiate new fixed exchange rate arrangements that would replace Bretton Woods. The Smithsonian Agreement of December 1971 represented an attempt to restore fixed exchange rate stability without gold convertibility, featuring dollar devaluation and new exchange rate parities that were supposed to address trade imbalances while maintaining international monetary cooperation. The failure of the Smithsonian system within 14 months demonstrated that fixed exchange rates were impossible to maintain without some form of automatic adjustment mechanism, as speculative pressures continued overwhelming government reserves while policy coordination remained inadequate for maintaining artificial exchange rate levels. European attempts to maintain regional monetary stability through the snake-in-the-tunnel arrangement reflected recognition that international monetary cooperation was still necessary even after global arrangements had collapsed. But these regional experiments also proved vulnerable to speculative pressure and policy conflicts. The shift toward floating exchange rates that occurred gradually between 1971 and 1973 represented abandonment of humanity's oldest economic institution, fixed exchange rates based on metallic standards in favor of a monetary system based entirely on government discretion and market forces. Central bank intervention in foreign exchange markets under floating arrangements required developing new techniques for managing currency values without fixed reference points. As monetary authorities learned to influence exchange rates through market operations rather than maintaining convertibility commitments, academic economics embraced floating exchange rates as more efficient than fixed-rate systems, arguing that market-determined exchange rates would automatically correct trade imbalances while enabling countries to maintain independent monetary policies that could address domestic economic objectives without international constraints. The oil price shock of 1973 provided the first major test of the new floating exchange rate system, as energy price increases created different effects on different countries' balance of payments, while exchange rate movements provided adjustment mechanisms that had been unavailable under fixed-rate arrangements. Inflation acceleration during the 1970s reflected the monetary expansion that abandoning gold constraints enabled, as governments could finance spending programs and economic stimulus through money creation without the automatic limits that gold convertibility had previously imposed on monetary growth. International banking expansion during the 1970s reflected both the opportunities and instabilities that floating exchange rates created, as banks developed sophisticated foreign exchange and international lending operations while managing currency risks that had been minimal under fixed exchange rate arrangements. Petrodollar recycling demonstrated how the new monetary system could accommodate large-scale capital flows and international financial imbalances that would have created severe adjustment pressures under gold standard or fixed exchange rate arrangements. But this flexibility also created new forms of financial instability. Dollar's continued role as the primary international currency despite loss of gold backing reflected American economic strength and the absence of attractive alternatives. But this role also created ongoing tensions about American monetary policy's international effects and other countries' dependence on Federal Reserve decisions. The philosophical implications of abandoning gold-backed money represented a fundamental change in human economic relationships, as money became an entirely artificial government creation rather than a measurement of intrinsic value, altering the relationship between individual economic behavior and societal resource allocation in ways that are still being discovered. By 1973, the world had completed its transition from gold-based monetary systems that had provided stability and discipline for over 2 millennia to floating exchange rates and fiat currencies that offered policy flexibility at the cost of monetary predictability and automatic constraint mechanisms that had previously limited government and central bank discretion. Floating chaos. The period between 1973 and 1979 represented humanity's first experience with a completely unanchored international monetary system, as floating exchange rates and fiat currencies created unprecedented volatility, inflation, and financial instability that demonstrated both the opportunities and dangers inherent in abandoning the metallic monetary standards that had governed human economic relationships for millennia. Exchange rate volatility that characterized the early floating period was far greater than economists had predicted, as major currencies experienced fluctuations of 10 to 20% within months, while daily movements of 2 to 3% became commonplace. This volatility created new risks for international trade and investment, while requiring businesses and financial institutions to develop hedging techniques that had been unnecessary under fixed exchange rate regimes. The dollar's decline during the mid-1970s reflected both the removal of gold backing and international concerns about American economic policy, as inflation acceleration and government spending expansion reduced confidence in the currency that remained the primary international medium of exchange, despite losing its gold convertibility. German monetary policy during this period illustrated how countries with strong anti-inflation traditions could maintain currency stability under floating arrangements, as the Bundesbank's commitment to price stability enabled the Deutsche Mark to appreciate against other currencies while providing a relatively stable anchor for European monetary relationships. Japanese economic adaptation to floating exchange rates demonstrated how export-oriented economies could benefit from currency flexibility, as yen appreciation reflected Japan's improving competitive position while enabling domestic monetary policy to focus on price stability rather than exchange rate maintenance. The Great Inflation of the 1970s represented the most severe price instability in developed economies since the gold standard's abandonment, as governments discovered that removing monetary constraints enabled inflation rates that would have been impossible under gold-based systems, while demonstrating the difficulties of controlling inflation through discretionary monetary policy. Energy price shocks provided external pressures that floating exchange rate systems had to accommodate, as oil price increases created different effects on different countries, while exchange rate movements provided adjustment mechanisms that distributed the costs of energy price changes across countries rather than forcing concentrated adjustment in particular economies. International banking adaptation to floating rates required developing sophisticated foreign exchange operations and currency risk management techniques, as banks learned to profit from exchange rate volatility while providing customers with hedging services that enabled continued international business despite currency uncertainties. The euro currency markets expanded dramatically during the floating rate period, as banks and multinational corporations sought to avoid domestic regulatory constraints while taking advantage of interest rate and exchange rate differentials that floating arrangements created between different countries and currencies. Developing country debt accumulation during the 1970s reflected both the opportunities and dangers that floating exchange rates and recycled petrodollars created, as countries borrowed heavily in dollars while believing that inflation would reduce real debt burdens, creating vulnerabilities that would become apparent when monetary policies changed. Central bank intervention in foreign exchange markets evolved from maintaining fixed parities to managing floating rates, as monetary authorities learned to influence currency values through market operations while avoiding the fixed commitments that had made previous systems vulnerable to speculative attacks. Regional monetary cooperation attempts, including the European monetary system, reflected recognition that floating exchange rates created instabilities that were particularly problematic for closely integrated economies, leading to efforts to create zones of exchange rate stability within the broader floating rate system. Academic research on exchange rate behavior revealed that floating rates were far more volatile and less predictable than economic models had suggested, leading to development of new theories about market psychology, speculation, and the relationship between fundamentals and exchange rate movements. Inflation targeting emerged as central banks attempted to provide nominal anchors that could substitute for the discipline that gold standards had previously provided. But early attempts at controlling inflation through monetary policy proved less effective than theoretical models had suggested. International policy coordination became more complex under floating arrangements, as countries' monetary and fiscal policies had different international transmission effects than under fixed exchange rates, requiring new forms of cooperation while reducing the automatic adjustment mechanisms that gold standards had provided. Trade policy conflicts intensified under floating exchange rates, as currency movements could offset trade policy measures while creating new sources of commercial disputes about exchange rate, manipulation, and competitive devaluation that had been impossible under gold standard arrangements. Financial market development accelerated during the floating period, as exchange rate and interest rate volatility created demand for new financial instruments and risk management techniques while providing opportunities for speculation and arbitrage that generated enormous profits for sophisticated market participants. Corporate financial management became more complex as businesses learned to manage currency and interest rate risks that had been minimal under gold standard and fixed exchange rate arrangements, leading to development of sophisticated treasury operations and financial hedging strategies. International investment patterns changed under floating arrangements, as investors had to consider currency risks alongside traditional investment criteria, while portfolio diversification across currencies became both more important and more complex than under fixed exchange rate systems. The relationship between monetary policy and international competitiveness became more direct under floating rates, as expansionary monetary policies could lead to currency depreciation that improved trade performance, while contractionary policies could cause appreciation that reduced competitiveness. Economic forecasting became more difficult as floating exchange rates added new sources of uncertainty to business planning and policy analysis, while traditional economic relationships proved less stable when monetary anchors were removed and policy discretion was expanded. The philosophical implications of operating without monetary anchors became apparent as inflation expectations became self-fulfilling, while long-term planning became more difficult due to increased uncertainty about future monetary conditions and government policy responses to economic challenges. Financial crises became more frequent and severe, as floating exchange rates and increased capital mobility created new channels for transmitting instability across borders while removing automatic adjustment mechanisms that gold standards had provided for correcting international imbalances. By 1979, the accumulated experience with floating exchange rates and fiat currencies had demonstrated that removing monetary discipline created both opportunities for policy flexibility and risks of instability that required new institutional arrangements for managing monetary policy and international economic relationships. Digital disruption. The emergence of digital technologies and electronic financial systems since 1980 has fundamentally transformed money and banking in ways that have accelerated the departure from gold-based monetary principles while creating new possibilities for both government control and private monetary innovation that challenge traditional concepts of what money is and how monetary systems should operate. Electronic funds transfer systems developed during the 1980s eliminated much of the physical handling of money that had connected monetary systems to their gold standard origins, as computerized clearing and settlement systems enabled instantaneous transfers of vast sums while reducing the tangible aspects of money that had made gold backing seem necessary. Central bank digital technologies evolved to manage money supplies and interest rates with precision that would have been impossible under gold standard operations, as computer models and electronic market interventions enabled monetary policies that could respond to economic conditions within hours rather than the months or years that gold standard adjustments had required. Derivatives markets that exploded during the 1980s and 1990s created financial instruments of enormous complexity and size that bore no relationship to the real assets or gold backing that had anchored traditional monetary systems, as financial engineering produced synthetic instruments whose values depended entirely on mathematical relationships rather than physical commodities. High-frequency trading technology developed during the 2000s enabled financial transactions at speeds that made any form of metallic backing irrelevant, as computer algorithms could execute thousands of trades per second while generating profits from price movements that lasted only milliseconds. Credit creation through securitization and complex financial instruments expanded the effective money supply far beyond any relationship to gold reserves or even central bank currency issuance, as shadow banking systems created credit and liquidity through mechanisms that traditional monetary theory had never contemplated. Electronic payment systems including credit cards, debit cards, and digital wallets gradually eliminated physical currency from most transactions, making money an increasingly abstract concept that existed primarily as electronic entries in computer systems rather than physical objects with intrinsic value. Algorithmic trading and quantitative finance created market operations that bore no relationship to the fundamental value considerations that had supported gold-backed monetary systems, as computer-driven strategies generated profits from mathematical relationships and statistical patterns rather than underlying economic conditions. Financial globalization enabled by digital communications created integrated worldwide markets that could move vast amounts of capital instantaneously across borders, making national monetary policies interconnected in ways that gold standard operations had never achieved while creating vulnerabilities that no single country could control. Central bank balance sheet expansion after 2008 demonstrated the unlimited money creation capacity that digital systems enabled, as quantitative easing programs created trillions of dollars, euros, and yen through electronic entries without any physical constraints that gold backing would have imposed. Cryptocurrency development, beginning with Bitcoin in 2009, represented attempts to recreate some of the discipline and scarcity that gold had provided while using digital technology to eliminate government control over money creation, demonstrating ongoing desire for monetary systems that were not subject to political manipulation. Blockchain technology offered possibilities for creating decentralized monetary systems that could provide some of the predictability and limited supply characteristics that gold standards had offered, while enabling peer-to-peer transactions without traditional banking intermediation or government oversight. Mobile payment systems developed during the 2010s enabled financial transactions through smartphones and digital platforms that made physical currency obsolete for many users, while creating monetary systems that existed entirely in digital form without any tangible backing or physical constraints. Stablecoin development represented attempts to create digital currencies that maintained stable value through various mechanisms, including backing by traditional currencies, commodities, or algorithmic supply management that sought to reproduce gold standard stability through technological means rather than metallic backing. Central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, currently under development, would complete the transition from gold-backed money to purely digital government currencies, while providing authorities with unprecedented capabilities for monitoring and controlling individual economic transactions. Artificial intelligence applications in finance enable automated decision-making about monetary policy, credit allocation, and financial market operations that remove human judgment from economic relationships, while creating systems that operate according to algorithmic rules rather than traditional economic principles. Internet of Things (IoT) technologies are enabling machine-to-machine payments and automated financial transactions that could create entirely new forms of money and payment systems operated independently of traditional banking, while challenging existing concepts about what constitutes monetary systems. Digital identity and biometric authentication systems are being integrated with payment technologies to create financial systems that could link individual identity directly to monetary transaction, while providing governments with capabilities for economic surveillance and control that would have been impossible under gold standard operations. Quantum computing development poses both opportunities and threats for digital monetary systems, as quantum technologies could enable unprecedented computational capabilities for financial analysis, while also threatening the cryptographic security that protects digital currencies and electronic financial systems. Programmable money concepts, including smart contracts, enable automatic execution of complex financial arrangements without human intervention, while creating possibilities for monetary systems that operate according to predetermined rules rather than discretionary policy decisions by governments or central banks. Decentralized finance (DeFi) platforms are attempting to recreate traditional banking functions, including lending, borrowing, and investment services without centralized institutions, while using digital technologies to provide financial services that operate independently of traditional monetary authorities. Non-fungible tokens (NFTs) and digital assets are creating new forms of value storage and exchange that bear no relationship to traditional monetary concepts, while demonstrating how digital scarcities can create economic value without physical backing or government guarantees. Cross-border payment innovations, including digital remittances and international transfers, are reducing the costs and settlement times for international transactions, while creating alternatives to traditional banking systems and official exchange rate mechanisms. Financial inclusion initiatives using digital technologies are extending monetary services to populations that had been excluded from traditional banking, while creating new forms of money and payment, systems that operate outside conventional financial infrastructure. Regulatory challenges created by digital financial innovation are forcing governments to develop new frameworks for overseeing monetary systems that operate through technologies and business models that existing laws and institutions were not designed to address. The acceleration of technological change in monetary systems suggests that the current period of transition from gold-backed to digital money may be followed by even more fundamental changes, could transform human economic relationships in ways that are currently difficult to predict or understand.